On Christmas Day, my son locked the door and said, "You are no longer family. Get out." He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He said it the way someone reads a weather report: calm, certain, final. Behind him, his wife laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward one. It was the kind of laugh that comes from winning something, from watching someone finally fall into the place you always believed they belonged. I stood there in the cold, my hand still raised from knocking, my breath fogging the glass of a house I had helped him buy. Inside, the table was set with expensive plates, crystal glasses, and people who mattered more than I ever did. Men in tailored suits, women with practiced smiles, the kind of guests who talk about markets instead of memories. My son looked at me the way you look at an old tool you no longer need. "You don't fit here anymore," he said. "Only Bethany's family does." For a moment, I waited for anger, or shame, or that familiar instinct to apologize, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. None of it came. Instead, I nodded. I turned around, walked back to my car, sat down, and closed the door. My hands were steady when I reached for my phone. I made one call. I didn't beg. I didn't explain. I didn't raise my voice. I said exactly 12 words. 5 minutes later, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the guests inside that house began to stand up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coats were collected. Apologies were murmured, polite and hollow. The kind people use when they suddenly realize they are standing on the wrong side of something. Through my windshield, I watched the front door open again and again. Men who wouldn't look at me earlier walked past my car without meeting my eyes. A woman dabbed at her lipstick, suddenly embarrassed. Another shook her head slowly, as if trying to understand how the evening had gone so wrong so fast. Within minutes, the driveway emptied. Luxury cars pulled away into the winter night, their headlights cutting through the dark like retreating soldiers. And inside that house, behind the locked door that had kept me out, my son and his wife were left alone. No audience, no applause, no inheritance, just silence. I sat there for a moment longer, listening to the engine idle, feeling the weight of 70 years pressed gently against my chest. I thought about the boy I once carried on my shoulders. I thought about the man who had just erased me. And I realized something important. This wasn't about revenge. This was about consequences. And the night was only getting started. I didn't raise my son in comfort. I raised him in consistency. For 40 years, I worked construction sites across Colorado. Not management, not ownership. I was the man who showed up before sunrise, pulled on steel-toed boots with aching knees, and measured his worth by whether the building stood straight at the end of the day. My hands paid for everything my son ever became. I started at 23, fresh out of trade school, with a borrowed toolbox and a beat-up pickup truck that stalled every winter morning. By 30, I was already working double shifts, 12 hours on site, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Concrete doesn't care about birthdays. Steel beams don't pause for family dinners. By the time Cody was born, I had learned a simple truth. If I didn't work, nothing happened. When he was 5, I missed his first school play because a pour went wrong and we had to redo the foundation before the temperature dropped. I still remember coming home after midnight, boots caked in dried cement, finding the little paper crown he'd made sitting on the kitchen table. His mother told me he'd look for me in the crowd. I told myself I'd make it up to him. That became my pattern. When he was 8, I worked an extra contract to move us into a better school district. The house wasn't big, 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, but it was clean, safe, and close to good schools. I paid $212,000 for it, every dollar earned the hard way. When he was 12, I turned down a promotion that would have moved me out of state because he didn't want to leave his baseball team. I kept my head down and kept working. When he was 16, he wanted a private high school. Tuition was $18,000 a year. I didn't hesitate. I picked up night work inspecting sites and spent 3 years sleeping 4 hours a night. I told him it was nothing. By the time college came around, I had already saved $94,000. Still not enough. So I did what I'd always done. I worked more. 18-hour days for almost 3 years straight. Missed holidays, missed friends' funerals, lived on gas station coffee and painkillers for my back. By the time Cody graduated, I had paid $136,000 in tuition, housing, and expenses. I never once asked for a thank you. That's what fathers do, or at least, that's what I believed. I remember the night before his graduation. I came home at 3:00 a.m. after finishing a rush project on a commercial build. My hands were bleeding through my gloves. My shirt smelled like sweat and steel. Cody hugged me and said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." I carried that sentence for years. After college, I helped him with his first apartment. $42,000 down payment. Furniture, utilities, groceries for the first few months until he found his footing. I told him every dollar was an investment in his future. When he married Bethany, I stayed quiet. Her family had money, real money, country club money, development money, the kind that talks about legacy instead of overtime. At first, Cody still sounded like my son. Then the comparisons started, subtle ones. Peter thinks pensions are outdated. Peter says real wealth works for you. Peter built everything himself. The first time he said that, I almost laughed. Everything I built was right in front of him, but I kept my mouth shut, because fathers adapt, because love isn't loud. I watched his clothes change, his language, the way he stood straighter when he talked about Bethany's father and smaller when he talked about me. I watched my 40 years of work shrink into a punchline about worker mentality. I kept showing up anyway. I brought groceries. I fixed things around the house. I stayed invisible when his world no longer needed me front and center. I thought sacrifice was something that paid off eventually. I was wrong. What I didn't understand then was that sacrifice without boundaries doesn't teach gratitude. It teaches entitlement. And by the time Christmas came, my son no longer saw my hands as proof of love. He saw them as proof of embarrassment. The change didn't happen overnight. If it had, I might have fought it, asked questions, pushed back. But decay is quiet. It works slowly, patiently, like rust under fresh paint. At first it was the phone calls. They got shorter, 5 minutes instead of 30. Updates instead of conversations. When I asked about his work, he answered with rehearsed confidence, phrases he'd borrowed from someone else. Things are moving fast, big opportunities. You wouldn't really understand the space. I told myself that was normal. Sons grow up. They build lives. They don't need their fathers hovering. Then the visits changed. When Cody came over, he walked through my house like a guest instead of a son. His eyes lingered on the worn furniture, the small television, the simple tools mounted neatly in the garage. He didn't criticize them outright. He didn't have to. Silence can judge just as sharply. One afternoon, while I was fixing a loose step on the porch, he stood behind me and said, "You know, Bethany's dad would have just hired someone for this." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do. "Well," I said, tightening the last screw, "then he would have missed out on the satisfaction." Cody smiled politely, the way you smile at someone who just proved your point. Birthdays came and went. One year he forgot completely, texted me the next day with a quick apology and a gift card. Another year he sent a watch I knew Bethany had picked out. Expensive, impersonal, heavy on the wrist, light on meaning. The words changed too. He stopped saying "we" when he talked about family. He started saying "they" when he talked about Bethany's parents. They think long term. They have real influence. They understand how the world works. I was still there, still fixing things, still listening, still offering help that was no longer asked for. I noticed how he talked to me when Bethany was around. Shorter sentences, sharper tone, like he was embarrassed by how easily I laughed, how directly I spoke, how little I cared about impressing anyone. Once, during dinner at their place, Bethany made a joke about my hands. "They look so rough," she said, holding hers up next to mine, "like sandpaper." Everyone laughed. I smiled too. Old habit. Inside, something folded in on itself. Another time, Cody said, "Dad, maybe don't talk about work so much tonight. Peter's friends are here." That was the first time I felt it clearly. Not rejection, replacement. I wasn't his example anymore. I was his before. I tried to adjust, wore nicer clothes when I visited, chose my words more carefully. I even stopped offering to help unless I was asked. Nothing changed. The more I pulled back, the more he leaned forward into their world. By the time Christmas approached, I had already been moved to the margins of his life. Invitations felt obligatory. Conversations felt curated. Still, I told myself one thing: family doesn't discard family. I held on to that belief like a man gripping a handrail in rough water. So when he invited me over on Christmas Day, I thought maybe, just maybe, this was a reset, a moment of humility, a chance to reconnect. I ironed my shirt carefully, brought a small gift I knew he wouldn't need but might appreciate. I knocked on the door with the same hand that had paid for his education, fixed his first home, and held him steady when he learned to ride a bike. And when he looked at me through that door, I saw no hesitation, only calculation. That was when I understood something I should have learned much earlier. The decay hadn't started with Bethany. It hadn't started with money. It started the first time my son chose comfort over character and didn't feel the loss. And by the time he told me I was no longer family, the decision had already been made. All he did that day was say it out loud. The words themselves weren't loud. That's what made them devastating. "You are no longer family. Get out." No shaking voice, no anger, no hesitation, just a statement delivered with the calm certainty of someone who believed he was finally correcting a mistake. My son stood in the doorway like a gatekeeper to a life I had financed but was no longer welcome in. His shoulders were squared, his posture confident, as if this moment had been rehearsed in his mind long before it ever reached his lips. Behind him, Bethany leaned against the wall, smiling, not nervously, not apologetically. She smiled like someone watching a plan unfold exactly as expected. I looked past them into the house. The table was already set. Fine china, crystal glasses, linen napkins folded with care. Men in tailored suits stood in small circles, talking about markets, acquisitions, and things that moved money instead of people. Women laughed softly, holding wine glasses like accessories instead of drinks. No one looked at me. I wasn't part of the scene. I cleared my throat, not because I needed to speak, but because my body hadn't caught up to what had just happened. "Cody," I said quietly, "it's Christmas." He sighed. Actually sighed. The way a man does when he believes he's being generous with his patience. "This isn't about emotion," he replied. "This is about reality." Reality. That word landed harder than any insult. Bethany stepped forward. "You don't belong in this world," she said, her voice light, almost bored. "You make people uncomfortable." I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, finality. I realized then that this wasn't a moment of cruelty. It was a conclusion, a verdict reached long before I arrived at the door. "You embarrass us," Cody continued. "Bethany's parents are here. They're partners, they're friends, people who matter." I nodded slowly. People who matter. I thought about the years I'd spent measuring success by whether my son slept safely under a roof I'd paid for, whether his future was easier than my past, whether he ever felt small in a world that didn't forgive weakness. And now I was the weakness. I took a step back, the cold air wrapping around me like a verdict carried out. Bethany laughed again, quieter this time. "This went better than I expected," she said to Cody, not bothering to lower her voice. That was when I understood. This wasn't just rejection. This was performance. They wanted witnesses. They wanted contrast. They wanted me small so they could feel large. I turned away without another word. As I walked down the steps, I heard the lock slide into place behind me. That sound did something to me. It erased 37 years of excuses I'd made for him. In my car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. My reflection stared back at me from the windshield. An old man, rough hands, lines carved by decades of work and sacrifice. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to feel it, the betrayal. Not the sharp kind, the deep one. The kind that doesn't scream, but settles into your bones and changes the way you see the past. I thought about every overtime shift, every missed holiday, every dollar I had poured into his future, believing it would build character. Instead, it built entitlement. I drove home in silence. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my mailbox was crooked, bent, damaged. Fresh scratches in the metal. At first, I thought it was kids. Then I remembered the scraping sounds I'd heard after Cody left earlier that evening. Something cold slid into place. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. I went inside, sat down in my chair, and stared at the wall where family photos used to hang before I took them down one by one. I didn't feel weak. I felt awake. Later that night, sleep came in fragments, and when morning arrived, it brought clarity instead of confusion. Because betrayal, when it's complete, removes all doubt. And doubt is the last thing a man needs when he's about to make a decision that will change everything. The call came the next morning, not from my son, not from his wife. From truth. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the bent mailbox through the window, when the phone rang. The name on the screen made me pause. Peter Mills, Bethany's father. The man my son worshipped. The man whose approval he chased like oxygen. The man whose money had quietly replaced my presence in Cody's life. I answered on the third ring. "Joseph," Peter said. His voice was calm, measured. "We need to talk." There was no accusation in his tone, no anger, just gravity. "I think," he continued, "you and I were both lied to." I sat down slowly. He explained that earlier that morning he'd received an anonymous message. Not dramatic, not emotional, just facts. A recording, clear enough that there was no room for interpretation. Bethany's voice, Cody's laughter, plans, humiliation, inheritance. I closed my eyes as he spoke. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. "I wanted to hear it from you directly," Peter said, "before I decide how to handle this." For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small talking to him. "I didn't plan for you to hear it like that," I said. But yes, that conversation was real. There was a long pause. "I built my company by cutting people loose the moment I realized they were dishonest," Peter said finally, "family or not." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. We met that afternoon, not at his house, not at a club, at a quiet diner halfway between our neighborhoods. No audience, no performance. Just two fathers sitting across from each other with coffee cups and uncomfortable truths between us. Peter didn't waste time. "They wanted to use you," he said, "as contrast, as proof, as leverage." I nodded. "They wanted to use you," I replied, "as a wallet and a legacy." We shared a bitter smile. "I didn't raise my daughter to be cruel," he said, "but I also know what entitlement looks like when it's fed too long." I told him everything then, not with emotion, with precision. The years of sacrifice, the gradual decay, the final rejection, the locked door, the laughter. I told him I didn't want revenge. "I want consequences," I said, "the kind that teaches something." Peter leaned back, studying me the way powerful men study contracts before signing them. "You understand," he said slowly, "that once I act, there's no undoing this." "I understand," I replied. "That's the point." We sat there in silence for a moment. Then Peter nodded. "Tomorrow night," he said, "Christmas dinner, at their house." I already knew where this was going. "They want a stage," he continued. "Let's give them one." We agreed on everything in less than 10 minutes. No shouting, no confrontation. Just truth, delivered publicly. He would speak, I would leave, and the guest would decide for themselves what kind of people they wanted to associate with. As we stood to leave, Peter placed a hand on my shoulder. "You raised your son with honesty," he said. "What he did with it isn't on you." That was the moment something settled inside me. The doubt, the self-blame, the habit of carrying other people's failures as my own. That night I went home and cooked, not out of spite, out of readiness. I set my table for 8, took out the good plates my wife used to save for special occasions, the ones I hadn't touched since her funeral. If they wanted to erase me, I would make sure I was standing exactly where I belonged when it happened. Not begging, not hiding, waiting. Because when the truth is strong enough, it doesn't need a voice. It just needs a witness. Silence can be louder than confrontation. After meeting Peter, I didn't call my son. I didn't text. I didn't warn anyone. I went home and did what I had done my entire life when something important was coming. I prepared. I shoveled the snow from my walkway with slow, deliberate movements. The cold air cleared my head. Each scrape of the shovel against concrete felt grounding, familiar. Honest work had always helped me think. Inside, the house was quiet. No voices. no accusations. Just the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I pulled out my wife's old recipe box, the one with grease stains and handwritten notes in the margins. I hadn't opened it in years. Cooking had been her domain. After she passed, I mostly lived on habit and simplicity. That day, I cooked with intention. A full Christmas dinner. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes with real butter, green beans I'd frozen myself the previous summer, an apple pie that took longer than I remembered. I wasn't expecting guests. I was preparing for outcomes. At the same time, somewhere across town, my son and his wife were rehearsing their roles. I knew how their minds worked now. They thought I was broken. They thought the mailbox, the locked door, the laughter had done their job. They believed silence meant surrender. That was their mistake. That afternoon, my phone rang once. Cody. I watched it vibrate on the counter until it stopped. Then a text. Dad, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Just don't come tonight. No apology, no reflection, just control. I didn't respond. Bethany tried next. You embarrassed yourself enough yesterday. Please don't do this. Again, I said nothing. Because traps don't work if the prey knows they exist. By evening, I was dressed in the same suit I wore to my wife's funeral. Dark blue, clean, modest. It fit a little looser now. Age does that. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who had spent decades solving problems without applause. The kind of man people underestimate. The kind of man who finishes what he starts. Before leaving, I set the table. 8 places. I didn't know who would fill them. I only knew they would be filled by people who chose to be there. As I locked the door behind me, I felt calm. Not hopeful, certain. Because the trap wasn't built with anger. It was built with patience. And patience always outlasts arrogance. Confidence is dangerous when it isn't earned. By the time evening arrived, my son believed he had already won. Cody stood in front of the mirror in his entryway, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. The house glowed behind him, every light carefully placed to show wealth, taste, success. This wasn't a home tonight. It was a stage. Bethany floated through the living room with a glass of wine, inspecting details like a director before opening night. The table, the seating, the sight lines. Everything had been planned. This is perfect, she said, smiling. Peter's partners will remember this. Cody laughed. They'll remember the contrast. He met me. In his mind, I was already standing at the door, shrinking under chandeliers I didn't belong beneath. He imagined my silence, my discomfort, my worn suit next to tailored perfection. He mistook restraint for weakness. That mistake ran deep. Guests arrived early, men who spoke in numbers, women who measured worth in networks and proximity. The room filled with easy laughter and expensive perfume. Cody played his role well. He shook hands. He nodded at the right moments. He spoke about future projects like they were already secured. He positioned himself carefully near Bethany's father, always half a step behind, eager but deferential. Bethany watched with satisfaction. Every now and then she glanced at the door, waiting. "This is going to be educational," she whispered to Cody when no one was listening. "For him," Cody replied. "He needs to understand where he stands." Neither of them noticed how often Peter checked his watch. Neither of them questioned why he hadn't poured a drink. Arrogance has a way of narrowing vision. Outside, I pulled up in my car and parked down the street. I sat there for a moment, engine off, watching silhouettes move behind the curtains. Laughter, movement, celebration. They were confident. That was necessary. Arrogance sharpens consequences. I stepped out into the cold air and walked toward the house. Each step felt deliberate, measured. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. When I reached the front door, I didn't knock. I rang the bell. The door opened exactly as expected. Cody looked at me and smiled. Not warmly, triumphantly. "Well," he said loudly enough for the room to hear, "you actually came." Bethany appeared behind him, eyes sparkling. "Oh, this is better than I imagined," she said. "You even wore that old suit." I could see guests turning now. Curious, anticipatory. This was the moment they'd rehearsed. "You don't belong here," Cody announced. "Only real family is welcome tonight." There it was, the final performance. I met his eyes and saw no doubt, no fear, just entitlement. The kind that comes from believing consequences only apply to other people. "I understand," I said calmly. That wasn't the reaction he expected. Bethany frowned slightly. "You should leave," she insisted, "before this gets embarrassing." I nodded. "It already has," I replied. Then I turned and walked away. Behind me, laughter erupted, relieved, mocking. Cody basked in it. He didn't know the applause was for his last act. I got back into my car and made the call. Peter answered on the first ring. "It's time," I said. "I know," he replied. Inside the house, Cody raised his glass, unaware that arrogance has an expiration date, and his was about to run out. Inside the house, the mood was celebratory. Music played softly. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed with the lazy confidence of people who believed the night belonged to them. Cody stood near the center of it all, smiling too much, talking too loudly. Bethany stayed close to her father, her hand resting lightly on his arm, performing affection with the precision of someone who understood optics. This was their moment. They thought the story had ended at the door. Peter cleared his throat. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room fell quiet anyway. He stood slowly, holding his glass, not raising it yet. His face was calm, composed, the expression of a man used to command rooms without asking permission. "I'd like to say a few words," he began. Cody's smile widened. Bethany straightened, already preparing for praise. Peter continued, "Tonight is about family, or at least that's what I was told." A few guests nodded. Someone murmured agreement. "But today," Peter said, pausing just long enough to let the silence stretch, "I learned something important about the people standing in this room." Cody shifted his weight slightly. Bethany's smile tightened. "I learned," Peter went on, "that some people believe success gives them the right to humiliate others, that money excuses cruelty, that loyalty only matters when it benefits them." The room grew still. A woman near the window set her glass down. Cody laughed lightly. "Dad?" I think Peter raised one finger. "Let me finish." That finger stopped everything. "I learned," he said, his voice even, "that an elderly man was deliberately invited here tonight, not as family, but as a prop, as a contrast, as a tool to manipulate me and everyone else in this room." Bethany's breath caught. Cody's face drained of color. "This man," Peter continued, was mocked behind his back, his life's work dismissed, his dignity treated as entertainment. A murmur rippled through the guests. Someone turned toward the door. "I will not," Peter said firmly, "be associated with that." The silence was no longer comfortable. It was sharp. "I built my company on trust," Peter said, "on knowing exactly who I'm doing business with. And tonight I saw something I can't unsee." He finally raised his glass. "To character," he said, "and to knowing when to walk away." Then he set the glass down and walked toward the door. It took a moment for the room to understand what had just happened. "Dad?" Bethany whispered. Peter didn't turn around. One guest stood, then another. Coats were picked up. Apologies whispered. Excuses formed quickly and collapsed just as fast. No one wanted to be the last one standing on the wrong side of that line. Cody's voice cracked. "Wait! This is a misunderstanding!" No one answered him. Within minutes the room emptied. The laughter was gone. The music felt intrusive. And the house that had been so carefully staged now echoed with absence. Outside, I watched it all unfold through my windshield. I saw Peter step into the cold night air. I saw the others follow. And I felt nothing but quiet certainty. The hammer had fallen. And it had only just begun. The silence after everyone left was worse than shouting. Cody stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by empty glasses, abandoned coats, and chairs pushed back without care. The music was still playing, soft and absurd, like a soundtrack that didn't know the movie was over. Bethany was the first to break. "What just happened?" she whispered, her voice thin, brittle. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Cody turned in a slow circle, as if the guests might suddenly reappear if he looked hard enough. His confidence had drained away, leaving something frantic underneath. "They misunderstood," he said, louder now. "That's all. Dad twisted it. He poisoned them." The word "Dad" sounded foreign in his mouth. Bethany grabbed her phone, hands shaking. She dialed Peter first. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. "Call his assistant," Cody snapped. She did. The call didn't go through. That was the moment panic replaced denial. Peter hadn't just left the house. He had left them. Cody sank onto the edge of the couch, head in his hands. "He can't do this," he muttered. "He needs me. I'm family." Bethany stared at him, realization dawning. "No," she said slowly, "he doesn't." The truth settled between them like ash. Their power had never been their own. It had been borrowed. And now the lender had reclaimed it. The door opened again. For a split second, hope flared in Cody's eyes. Then he saw me. I stepped inside calmly, closing the door behind me with the same care I used when finishing a job site inspection. Neither of them spoke. I looked around the room. The expensive furniture, the half-eaten food, the performance that had collapsed under its own weight. "So," I said quietly, "this is what winning looks like." Cody jumped to his feet. "You planned this," he shouted. "You humiliated us on purpose." "No," I replied evenly. "I let you humiliate yourselves." Bethany crossed her arms, defensive. "You went behind our backs." "I went around your lies," I corrected. "There's a difference." Cody's voice broke. "You cost me everything." I met his eyes. "No," I said, "you spent it." That landed harder than any insult. Bethany stepped forward, desperation replacing arrogance. "Joseph, please, we made a mistake. We were stressed. You didn't have to destroy our future." I studied her for a long moment. "You plan to destroy my dignity for entertainment," I said. "This is proportional." Cody shook his head violently. "You're supposed to be my father." "I was," I answered, "until you decided I was something to be ashamed of." His anger collapsed into pleading. "I'll apologize," he said quickly. "Publicly, privately, however you want. Just fix this." I felt no satisfaction hearing it, only clarity. "Apologies don't reverse character," I said. "They only reveal it." Bethany's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen and went pale. An email from Peter's law firm. She handed the phone to Cody without a word. He read it once, then again. Then his knees gave out and he sat heavily in the chair. "Termination of all business involvement, immediate removal from advisory roles, revocation of financial support, pending revisions to the estate plan." Every line precise, final. Bethany let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "You chose this," I said quietly, "when you decided money mattered more than loyalty, when you decided I was disposable." Cody looked up at me, eyes red. "What do I do now?" For the first time, the question was honest. "You live with it," I said, "like I did. You build something without stealing dignity from someone else." I turned toward the door. Behind me, Bethany was crying openly now. Cody said nothing. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and clean. I breathed deeply. The collapse was complete. I spent Christmas night alone, and for the first time in years, the silence felt earned. Snow fell quietly outside my window, covering the tire tracks that had carried my son and his wife away from my life. The house felt smaller without the weight of expectation, lighter without the constant effort of trying to matter to people who had already decided I didn't. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten thousands of quiet meals over decades of honest work. Nothing had changed about the room. The same chairs, the same scratches in the wood, the same clock ticking steadily on the wall. What had changed was me. For weeks after that night, I heard nothing from Cody. No calls, no apologies, no excuses. I later learned he lost his job within days. Without Peter's backing, doors closed quickly. Bethany moved out not long after. The kind of marriage built on leverage doesn't survive consequences. People like them confuse comfort with strength. They forget that comfort disappears the moment it's no longer funded. As for Peter, we stayed in touch. Not often, not formally, just two men who understood each other now. We met for coffee occasionally, talked about work, loss, and the strange clarity that comes when you stop protecting people from their own choices. One afternoon he looked at me and said, "You know, Joseph, you didn't lose a family. You escaped a lie." He was right. I stopped asking myself where I went wrong. I stopped replaying old conversations, searching for moments I could have fixed. Because the truth was simple. I gave my son everything I could without destroying myself. What he did with it was his responsibility. Now my days are quieter. I work in my garden. I fix things for neighbors who still knock on my door with respect in their eyes. I eat dinner when I'm hungry, not when I'm expected. I sleep without that tight feeling in my chest. And when people ask if I regret what happened, I tell them this: I regret confusing sacrifice with obligation. I regret believing love meant endless tolerance. but I do not regret standing still while the truth walked into the room. Because kindness without boundaries is weakness, and family loyalty that only flows one way is not loyalty at all. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've spent years giving while shrinking, understand this: you are not required to stay where you are disrespected. You are allowed to choose peace. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply stepping aside and letting consequences do the talking.